Hello and welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for today, Monday, November 7th, 2022. My name is Tom Luongo, and we have a lot to talk about. Today, I'm joined with me on the eve of probably the most consequential U.S. midterms since at least 1992. I have with me today Matt Ehret. And Matt and I, who I had on earlier in the year, and Matt and I haven't had a chance to talk really since I had him on the podcast then. And the first time I got a chance to meet Matt was when we did the roundtable discussion about whether Putin is a WEF agent with All Guardian and Off Guardian and Whitney Webb and all those guys, which was fun. And so Matt and I have been chatting back and forth since then. And I'm like, it's been a coon's age. It's time to have him back on because I think at this moment in time, Matt's historical perspective on the way things are operating, I think, is a really interesting dovetail to a lot of the things that I've been talking about. And so I wanted to pick his brain on a couple of those things. So, Matt, welcome to the show. And
thank you.
You're welcome. So now, with this said, before we started recording, we got talking about the cycles of history and cause and effect and all of this stuff, because we're here at a moment in time where we're reaching, I think, this big end of this big cycle of history, but we're dealing with people who firmly believe that there's no causal link of, in history, that, that history is just some things that happen, as opposed to a series of events that, lead from one into the other, into the other, into the other. And you were relating, some of these ideas as to the mindset of the people that are trying to do narrative control around all of the events of the day, that kind of try to support this idea, mostly, of course, in my mind, to absolve them of any blame or to obfuscate any intention on their part for purposely trying to destroy people's lives. So let's start there, and then we'll just see where we go from there. So that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And for those who weren't privy to our private conversation, which is pretty much everybody listening, we were using this example. I threw out this case study of a very, very useful gatekeeper who does a pretty good job for his handlers, who's a Harvard-based historian from Britain named Niall Ferguson. And Niall has written a lot of books that are deemed sort of authoritative gospel on the cause of World War I, on so many big matters: the cause of the Anglo-liberal establishment, the takeover of the Orange Revolution by the Dutch in 1688, the creation of the Bank of England. He's sort of known as a bit of a financial historian, and again, very Delphic, sleight of hand type of character. I think he's earning his paycheck pretty well, and he wrote an article. And in it, he makes the excuse that to be a responsible historian, one needs to only recognize the measurable facts of history and see history kind of like a mechanical machine. And in that machine, you cannot say that causal intentions that happened, let's say, or intentions in general that transcend the measurable components of the machine, have any impact on what is happening in your present world or future or anything. And he gives the example of how some people are stupid enough to attribute the causes of World War I to the ousting of Otto von Bismarck in 1890. And he's like, that is the most incompetent, superstitious idiocy, because that happened in 1890 and World War I was initiated in 1914. And we all know the cause of World War I was the shooting of the Archduke by the Black Hand of Serbia. And he's like, obviously. Now, the sleight of hand, for those who haven't figured it out, is that history is shaped by, and if you're watching Tom's show, you've probably come to discover on some level that intentions, conspiracies, agendas, ideas shape history. What is the weight of an idea? Where is it located? What about an intention? Right? These are not material things, but they are definitely causal. And I was giving the example of me, like, dropping my mouse. I just dropped my mouse. What caused that? The mechanic or mechanical historian would say, well, it was caused by my hand opening up, and they could have like an infinite regression of little mini mechanical causes, but they would miss the fact that I have an intention to make a point. Right. Now, the irony of that for Niall Ferguson and people who think like him is that the reason why I even have that idea as a good idea that I judge to be a good idea and that I'm using right now is because I read Socrates or Plato, from the Phaedo dialogue, which was written 2,300 years ago, where Socrates, upon his deathbed, makes that very point when he's told to drink the hemlock for having, committed the crime of corrupting the minds of the youth and, undermining the gods of Athens.
Right.
He's now sitting, waiting to take the poison, which the demos has seen fit to, punish him with. And he's like, well, he used that very same point. And so you could say, well, what caused me to do that isn't just my intention, but it was an intention that has been shaped by something that happened 2,300 years ago in ancient Athens, and my just reviewing of that thought, which has influenced me, right? So the oligarchy knows that intentions shape processes, and they work to keep their victims in a materialistic cage where all we think we can use is our five senses to measure things, plot things, create a model, and then hypothesize or create some extrapolation about what is shaping the model with no regard for truth.
Right.
Because as we've discovered, a lot of models, whether it's about pandemics or whether it's about climate change or whether it's about what the economy is doing and where it's going to go, they could just be influenced by whatever experts in a high priest position who can read the formulas or shape the programming of the code that goes into the computer model to get whatever results they want with no regard for reality. So it's all just a big sleight of hand.
Right. And it's very clear that this is a means of narrative control that is something that, it's powerful, because with at least with people who don't know how to think. And this is one of the things that my partner and I, Dexter White, have been talking about, like behind the scenes, like what's the ethos of Gold, Goats, and Guns, and if we're going to spin up like anything, if we were going to talk about anything else, like what are we shifting into as a product, as a thing that we put out into the world, is like, it's just reminding people that how you think about things and how you shape your arguments is very powerful. And like they've done everything imaginable to rob us of our reason, to rob us of our ability to do cause and effect. It's like, no, really, history doesn't have any through lines. It's just a bunch of shit that happened. And Neil Ferguson is obviously one of those guys. It's like, oh, it's just a bunch of shit that happened. And we can't explain anything because people are irrational or whatever they are. And like no, really, I think there's some deeper things going on in that. So, what touched off this conversation before we started recording was, I was saying that, we're in a moment in time, I think, at the end of the cycle of history where, we're coming to the end of this. And I brought up the idea of the Vietnamese foreign minister speaking to Henry Kissinger, back 30, 40 years ago now, saying, and Kissinger said, what do you think about the French Revolution? And the guy responded, I don't remember his name, but you do, and you'll tell me in a second, which is, well, it's just too early to tell. And to give you an idea, which is an example of how some cultures and some people, see things in a bigger timeline than, oh, I just dropped my mouse. Like, and this is the difference. Like, we're all supposed to be these dogs living in the present. I don't know if you know anything about dog psychology. Dogs don't have much. They have some memory, but they have emotional memory. They don't really they live in the moment. Dogs are great because they live in the moment. And they kind of want us to all just kind of live in the moment. Like, well, that's what we outsource that to our dogs, guys. That's what the dogs are for, so that we can sit down and actually view the tapestry of history and look at the threat assessment and have time and energy and discernment. That's what our brains do in order to get this shit done. Like, this is like reality. And so what I said to Matt beforehand is a point that I've made in other interviews and whatnot, not really on this podcast, which is that, given the current state of affairs, and given my position as both a market analyst and a geopolitical analyst, and not necessarily as much a historian, this is part of the reason why I wanted Matt on today, because it's, as a historian, my command of the facts of history are not great. So I bring people on who have a better understanding of history than I do, certainly. So you have this moment where, well, at the French Revolution in the minds of Asians, of ancient Asian cultures, is at the 200 years in arrears. It's too early to tell what the outcome of that is in their minds. I said, well, let's think about the situation today with the Federal Reserve, Europe, the Bank of England, the British Crown, and it just popped in my head one day. It's the same thing that's happening now. It's like we have this moment in time where the American Revolution, we should ask that same question of the American Revolution, which is to say, what do you think of the American Revolution? And I'm at the point now where I'm saying it's too early to tell.
Yeah.
Because the United States banking system has always been subordinate to European imperatives.
Yeah.
And in modern times, it's been the imposition of, the argument I've been making is the imposition of LIBOR as the debt indexing rate for basically all of Europe and the United States, and then how that has had ruinous effects, I believe, on, American domestic monetary and foreign policy over the last century or more than a century. And that we're now at a moment in time where it's very clear that, mechanistically speaking, the US financial system and the stewards of it are declaring independence. And so, my argument has been that the British Crown has wanted their colonies back since the day after Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. And Jerome Powell is going, yeah, but I no longer have to be beholden to LIBOR, and I can set monetary policy for my banks that I'm in charge of and that I'm beholden to. And no longer am I beholden to City of London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Milan, that, all those guys. So that's what sparked this entire original conversation. And when I said that to Matt, your response was, "Woo, that's interesting." And yeah, I think it is.
Well, absolutely. And I like the sensitivity to the long, more subtle but important waves of history that a lot of people don't pay attention to, because it's sort of easy to see the car accident, the person getting hit by the car outside when you look out the window, and it's like a crazy accident. It's really, really visceral imagery of what happened. But to actually appreciate that, a couple of weeks earlier, that person driving the car had caught his wife cheating on, with this guy who he just hit in the car. Like, it takes more mind work to hold that in the mind, and it's more subtle, maybe a bit more boring in some ways to get that part of the backstory, but it's like present and it's efficient as a causal effect. And if you were just a mechanist, you wouldn't really pay any regard to that. Because you'd just be saying, well, what caused this person to get hit and die? Well, it was this car moving at this speed, at this weight, at this, but the fact is, yeah, you're right. Like, the American experiment is an experiment. It is not a finished product. Nobody should have ever treated the United States in what happened in 1783, when the British delegation did not show up at the Peace of Paris signing. You have that painting that's half finished, and you have the American delegation sitting there with Ben Franklin and John Jay and a few others. The British delegation's not there. Benjamin West, the painter, had to just say, well, abort. They're just not going to show up. So, and I selected that painting for the cover of the first volume of the Unfinished Symphony, the Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 1, Unfinished Symphony. And I have that painting there because I think it just speaks so loudly that, the entirety of the 19th century and then into the 20th, into the present, it has been shaped by the lack of recognition and acceptance by the part of British grand strategists that this happened. And not only that, but they had been utilizing and cultivating fifth columnists, people who maybe on the surface acted like they were loyal American patriots, but in reality were always United Empire loyalists to their core, always obedient
right.
to commands, influence from the British, the City of London operations, the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, run by people like Jeremy Bentham, who, by the way, I'll just say, to get a taste of people are like, well, who would these fifth columnists be? Which I assert is at the heart of the deep state today. It's not in any way disconnected of what happened and what was built up in the 1780s and 90s in America. One example, if people want to know, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr lived with Jeremy Bentham, the head of the British Foreign Office, in his mansion for 5 years straight between 1807 and 1812. Aaron Burr, the former vice president, lives with Jeremy Bentham. Why? Why does he do that before being deployed back to the United States a few weeks before the War of 1812 is begun? Well, who the hell is Aaron Burr, right? I mean, Burr is a guy who was, yes, vice president, but he was caught. He was caught in 1807 for the third time orchestrating a secession movement to where the plan was, and there was a whistleblower, kind of like a Smedley Butler character on the inside who he thought he could trust, who was part of the conspiracy to work with the British to take the Louisiana territories that had just recently been purchased 3 years earlier by Jefferson.
Right.
Hamilton was actually a key negotiator behind the scenes for a lot of that stuff. But the idea was to take the Western territories, have Burr with his lackey, Colonel Wilkerson, who was actually a Habsburg spy, and his letters have come to the surface over the ensuing years that prove that he was actually a Habsburg spy. Right. And they were going to work together to then declare war on the Spanish more broadly, specifically over Florida and I think it was New Orleans. Mm-hmm. British soldiers and some American mercenaries. The whole thing was run out of the house. This whole conspiracy in 1807 was run out of the house of a fellow named Andrew Jackson, who was part of the Burr machine. That was his matter, was the headquarters. And then one of the key figures, who I think was a senator, blows the whistle to Congress. They do court hearings. They have an actual hearing on the Burr conspiracy. They have testimonials, witnesses, evidence presented. Somehow Burr gets away because they didn't have the smoking gun until a few decades after Burr dies, where it comes out that Anthony Merry, who was the British ambassador to America, wrote to the Foreign Office in 1804, right when Burr loses, because he had tried this a few years earlier when he was running for the governor of New York. He needed to be the governor, though, to make that work. But in 1804, Anthony Merry writes to his home office saying, we have just acquired the services of Aaron Burr, who is the vice president, but he cannot do anything, and he wants to give his services to the British cause. This is great. And you could read the whole transcript. It's there in archival material from the 1890s on archive.org. You can read this thing. I cite it a lot because it's useful. So Burr, he ends up getting acquitted on some technicality, but the whole publicity about this conspiracy, which involved him going in, he was supposed to basically take control of the West, depose Jefferson as president, impose himself, and then declare separation from the slave states of the South, who would then become their own pro-British Confederacy. He would join the Canadian British Confederacy, reconstitute, undo the Constitution, reconstitute the nation under sort of new pro-British principles, and it would just undo the experiment again. So to recap,
but correct me if I'm wrong, Niall Ferguson would tell you that you're crazy for even thinking
that has nothing to do with the present, or that would have nothing to do with what happened in 1860, what blew up later. Now, what happened in 1860?
What are you talking about?
Yeah. There's several generations in between. You can't say one caused the other. So Burr at that point, he's given $40,000 by John Jacob Astor, because the public they were more literate back in those days, and people were reading the paper, getting transcripts and feedback over weeks of what was going on in the hearings. There was enough hate of Burr at this point by the masses all over the United States that he couldn't even walk outside without getting tomatoes thrown at him. So he had to escape to Canada, where his nephew-in-law was the Governor General of Canada. The Governor General of Canada was his nephew-in-law through marriage, who gave him personal letters to meet up with Bentham in Britain, Lord Castlereagh, who's organizing the Congress of Vienna. At that same time, they're setting the stage for what do we do when we put down the Napoleon project and then reconstitute oligarchism in Europe. That's the guy. That's Castlereagh, who's managing that whole thing with Metternich and a bunch of Jesuits. So this guy goes there. He lives with Bentham in a drug-infested, opium-infested, orgiastic 5-year period that he says the best time of his life.
it's like American colonial Eyes Wide Shut, for fuck's sake.
It really is, yeah. It really is that. And then he comes back and he reconstitutes his machine after 5 years, and people have now forgotten a little bit of the drama. But this is the third attempt. He had tried this in 1800 when he was running for the president against Jefferson. He was only subverted by one vote, and that was purely because Hamilton put his whole backing behind getting Jefferson elected president, which upset Burr's need to be the president to break the Union into a Northern South. And then Hamilton goes and does it again in 1804 when Burr is trying plot number 2 to become governor of New York, the economic engine of the colony, or the young republic. Mm-hmm. And he's again subverted by Hamilton, who makes him lose a second time, kills Hamilton. and he's already taken over control of Hamilton's Bank in New York, turned it into this speculative Bank of Manhattan mechanism that becomes beholden to the city of London. So all of a sudden, this thing, and I think everyone knows that story.
So just to clarify, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do, which is Bank of New York or Bank of Manhattan. Is that today what you would consider Bank of New York Mellon?
Yeah.
Okay. That makes perfect sense. So Bank of New York Mellon today, I think, is because it would have merged with somebody else. If it's the same organization, then that also tracks, because now Bank of New York Mellon is one of the major money center banks in New York today that I've identified as being completely on board with the continued European subversion of the United States. Bank of New York Mellon, BOFA, and then obviously BlackRock which isn't a bank, but it has aspirations of being a bank. So now so this is all fascinating. This is all cool. Something came up in conversation the other day that I wanted to ask you about, which is and this is what before we started recording, I said to you, it's like something came up in conversation the other day. Can't remember what it was, but someone said, but ask Matt about this when you have him on the podcast, which is the following. Because, and this is coming from somebody who's, also in the story, and he said to me, like, I never thought about this. We have Napoleon, and we have the War of 1812. Napoleon goes to war on the same time that the British go to war against the United States. Same year, it's 1812. So I've never put those two things together. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and I want you to free associate now and tell me if there's any real, because you were kind of alluding to it a little bit. This because when your last statement just threw something together where you kind of, you've got Napoleon, and you've got and this is the thing that prompted me to say these things happen in the same year, the same calendar year.
Yeah, that was Napoleon's assault on Russia too. John Quincy Adams was the young ambassador at the time to Moscow or St. Petersburg, I guess.
Right.